Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight for tonight's History Talk with the Champaign County History Museum. We have a special guest with us today, Director Emeritus of Spurlock Museum of World Cultures, Wayne Pitard. Wayne received his PhD in 1982 from Harvard University in Ancient Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He joined the faculty of UIUC in 1983 as a professor in the Department of Religion, where he taught courses in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and religions of the ancient Near East. In 2007, he became director of the university's Spurlock Museum of World Cultures, which he led until his retirement in 2016. His research focused primarily on the religion of the ancient Canaanites, particularly on the surviving library of Canaanite religious texts found in the ruins of the city of Ugarit, Syria. Is that good? That good, Wayne? I practiced it. And dating back to about 1200 BCE. He is the author of 3 books, including Ancient Damascus and the Ugarit Baal Cycle, Volume 2, Text Translation and Commentary, and is working with his collaborator, Mark S. Smith of Princeton, on the 3rd and final volume of that series. In addition, he has published about 50 articles, including new editions and new photographs of several other texts from Ugarit. In September 2024, he also published Watchman Tell Us, John J. Bird, and Black Politics in Post-Civil War Illinois. He will explain how he came to write a book of 19th century African American history in his talk tonight. Now, let's welcome Wayne Pitard to the stage. Absolutely, Wayne.
Well, good evening. I appreciate your coming out today. I want to thank Will Best, who is manager of the Champaign County History Museum, for inviting me to come and speak tonight. I suspect many of you will have already gone to the museum, but if you haven't gone to the museum, you should really go because it is really a great museum and teaches you an awful lot about Champaign County. So, as noted in the introduction, although I've written the book Watchman Tell Us about John J. Bird, my primary training as a scholar has not been in American or African American studies, but rather in ancient Near Eastern cultures. My interest in John J. Bird developed from an unexpected turn of events in 2015 while I was still director of the Spurlock Museum of World Cultures at the University of Illinois. And doing some research for an exhibit we were planning to mount celebrating the university's 150th anniversary in 2017. While looking for information about people from the early days of the university who might be particularly interesting to highlight in the exhibit, I came across a paragraph in Winton Solberg's 1968 History of the University about one John J. Bird, an African American who had been appointed in 1873 to the Board of Trustees of the Illinois Industrial University, original name of the University of Illinois. Solberg noted the remarkable nature of Bird's appointment to this otherwise all-white board at an otherwise all-white university, and discussed what he could glean about him from the minutes of the board meetings that he attended during his time there from 1873 to 1882, and from a brief 8-line biography published in the 1918 University of Illinois Alumni Directory. But he otherwise was unable to find much information about Bird's life that might explain why the governor chose this 29-year-old African American to occupy this position, writing, quote, "Both his appointment and service are shrouded in mystery." Thinking that Bird could be a significant person to explore for the exhibit, I began to search for additional information about him, but discovered that virtually nothing seemed to be available. No biographies of Bird or articles specifically about him had been published, nor were there any encyclopedia articles or entries in biographical dictionaries of notable 19th century African Americans. Historians seemed almost entirely unaware of him. And since I was a non-expert in Illinois history, I was at first largely content to assume that beyond his appointment to the university, he had not played a significant role in the larger context of African American life in post-Civil War Illinois. Still hoping to find at least some information that might help me flesh out the context of his relationship to the university, I began to examine the Cairo Bulletin, the primary surviving early newspaper from Cairo, Illinois, where Byrd lived in 1873 when he received his appointment. Reading that paper, need to be a little closer. Reading that paper, I discovered that there was, in fact, much, much more to John Byrd than I could have imagined. That during the 1870s and 80s, this forgotten man had been the most prominent and influential African American in Southern Illinois. Is this better for people? That was part of that he was part of the first generation of black leaders, also mostly forgotten, who struggled to negotiate what was perhaps the most astonishing cultural transformation in the history of the United States, the transition of some 4 million people from the condition of enslavement to the status of citizen. That between 1864 and 1887, he was the primary voice representing the second largest community of African Americans in the state, the one residing in the city of Cairo, that he played a major role in the struggle for civil rights in both Cairo and across Illinois, that he shattered numerous racial barriers well beyond being named to the university board, that in Springfield during the late 1880s and 90s, he became co-editor and then editor of one of the leading African American newspapers of the era, and that he was recognized as a man of integrity, ability, and honesty by both his political allies and his enemies. And yet all of these achievements had been forgotten during the course of the 20th century. After I retired in 2016, I decided that I needed to continue researching Byrd's life, hoping to write an article about his significance. But as I found more and more information, the article expanded over the next 5 years into a book-length biography, which has now become Watchman Tell Us, published by the Southern Illinois University Press last September, and which in April won a Superior Achievement in Illinois History Award from the Illinois State Historical Society. I can tell you that because Illinois and African American history have not been my areas of academic expertise, the years I devoted to this project proved to be an astonishing education for me as I delved into aspects of the black experience about which I knew so little. So today I would like to give you a brief introduction to what I found out about this extraordinary individual. So John J. Byrd was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to free parents in 1844. His father, also named John Byrd, was a steamship steward on one of the many riverboats that traveled up and down the Ohio River, a good-paying but dangerous position. John's parents owned a home on the east side of town in the area of the largest concentration of African Americans in Cincinnati, situated on Broadway between New Street and 7th Street. It appears that John attended the segregated Cincinnati public schools from about 1849 to 1855, which seems to have been the only formal schooling he had. His father died when John was about 9 years old, and a year later, his mother married Augustus R. Green, a prominent African Methodist Episcopal minister, who was a strong proponent of education, a leading conductor on Cincinnati's Underground Railroad network, a newspaper editor, and an active proponent for civil rights who was involved in the political issues of the day. Augustus and John's mother, Catherine, imparted a love for the intellectual, for history, politics, and current affairs to John, and they trained him to be an excellent orator and an advocate for civil rights, founded in the value system of the AME Church's most activist wing. In 1855, the family moved to Zanesville, Ohio, where black children were not allowed to attend the public schools. So Augustus and Catherine appear to have provided the further education for John and his step-siblings themselves. In 1859, Green and his family moved to Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, out of fear for their safety because of the horrific 1850 fugitive slave law. John came of age in Windsor, married Annie Venable there in the fall of 1864, and they had their 2 children there, Egbert and John William, in 1866 and 1868. In 1864, during the months before he married, John, now 20 years old, made the first of several extended visits to the town of Cairo, located at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers at the very southern tip of Illinois, to work on behalf of its distressed population of African American refugees from the war-torn South, in need of food, clothing, and shelter, and without a clear legal status. They were free from slavery, yet not citizens, and without any defined rights. Cairo had been a very small town before the outbreak of the Civil War, with a population of about 2,000 in 1860, including only 47 black citizens. Culturally speaking, pre-war Cairo had more in common with the South than with Chicago. Its population overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party during the period when it was the pro-slavery party that also dominated the southern states. But with the outbreak of the war, the town's strategic location led the U.S. military to develop it as a key Union stronghold and supply depot for the Western Campaign. This development drastically changed the town's demographics. Between 1861 and 1864, Cairo's population quadrupled as businesses opened to supply the military's needs, and as numerous African American refugees, often called contrabands, arrived in town. By the end of 1864, the town's population was about 8,500. There it is. Yeah. The town's population was about 8,500, of which almost 2,100, or 24.5%, were African Americans. By 1870, the black community amounted to about 30% of the town's inhabitants. This was the second largest black community in Illinois after Chicago, and no other city of Cairo's size or larger possessed an African American community that constituted such a large percentage of the population. Chicago's community constituted only about 1% of the city's inhabitants. Byrd arrived in Cairo in 1864, a charismatic, ambitious young man, well educated and politically active, and with the specific intention of aiding and organizing this population of refugees into a new cohesive community. From the beginning, he showed a remarkable facility for organization, working with and gaining the confidence of people from a wide range of cultural backgrounds, both in the black community and among whites, including the Republican politicians with whom he began to work. No sources reveal why Byrd chose to focus on Cairo. His stepfather Augustus, mother, and younger stepbrother Richard moved that same year to Washington, D.C. to help the contrabands who had flooded into that city. But John chose to work toward political and civil rights for the community in Cairo. Between 1864 and 1868, he spent months at a time annually in Cairo, and from his first visit, he quickly became the primary voice representing the city's black community, shaping numerous aspects of its development. In 1869, he moved his family to Cairo, and while continuing his community work, also read law with one of the white Republican attorneys in town, and got a position as a Pullman porter on the Illinois Central Railway, one of the better paying jobs open to black men in the latter part of the 19th century. He joined other prominent newcomers, including the Reverend Thomas Strother of the AME Church, William T. Scott, picture here, a young saloon owner and bail bondsman, and John Gladney, a laborer turned businessman, in working during the succeeding years to define this new community of free citizens advocating for their rights, including schools for both children and adults, adequate housing, and medical care. Children's education was a major focus of Byrd's activities in Cairo throughout his residence there. The earliest reference to him in the city is a newspaper account from the summer of 1864, mentioning that on July the 4th, he had given a speech at a celebration of the government contraband school. This, we think, is a picture of the students right around 1864 at the school. With the end of the war, a number of black churches established small schools for children and adults that all survived on small tuition payments by the parents. And Byrd worked with Reverend Strother to found a tuition-free private school. By 1867, they had established the Cairo Educational Association to run and fundraise for the school, with Byrd as its president. However, Byrd did not restrict his attention just to the Educational Association school. He also was apparently key to securing state funding for the rebuilding of a destroyed Baptist school for black children, in 1869. His community work went far beyond education. For example, in 1865, he chaired a community protest meeting over the Democratic City Council's refusal to obey the new Illinois law giving blacks the right to sue whites in court. In 1867, he led the formation in Cairo of one of the earliest Illinois Prince Hall Masonic lodges outside of Chicago, the most significant mutual aid society in black communities of the day. And perhaps most critically, beginning in the late 1860s, he, along with William Scott and John Gladney, established the largest, most powerful, and most durable civil rights organization in the city. This organization, surprisingly, was not centered around Cairo's African American churches, as was commonly the case. Unfortunately, they were hopelessly divided and antagonistic toward each other during the post-war period. Rather, Byrd and his partners framed their vision of an activist social movement around a more secular concept, the Black Republican Club. By distinguishing themselves from the contentious religious organizations in town and focusing the club on the goals of voting rights, education, job development, legal equality, and similar issues, they were able to develop a political organization that could unify the community in a way that the churches were unable to do. Once black men, not yet women, received the right to vote through the 15th Amendment in 1870, they joined the small white Republican minority in Cairo to bring the party to near parity with the strongly anti-black Democrats who had dominated the city government, allowing them sometimes to elect Republicans to office. The Black Wing, organized and led by Byrd, constituted about 60% of the Republican vote in Cairo, which allowed them to pressure their white colleagues to to recognize the needs of the black community in a way that was rarely the case anywhere else in Illinois or in the majority of other northern states. Thus, in southern Illinois, one of the most stridently anti-black regions in the entire North, John Byrd helped usher in a period of expanded civil rights for Cairo's African American community that was exceptional, leading to the early appearance of a black public school, though segregated, that was essentially equal in quality to the white schools. The election of numerous African American officials in the city and county governments over a period of nearly 40 years. City jobs and business contracts, and the integration of all the public buildings and many businesses within the city. By 1870, Byrd had become the leading black Republican in all of southern Illinois, and he made certain that when an election was held, almost all of the eligible black voters turned out and voted Republican. His leadership in this led the local white Republicans in the spring of 1870 to appoint Byrd as the first black delegate to a Republican regional convention, the nominating convention for the U.S. Congressman from the 18th District. By the fall of 1871, he had led the successful campaign to establish the African American Public School in Cairo, a year before the state legislature finally passed a law requiring the education of black children. In March of 1873, the seemingly impossible happened. Illinois Industrial University, original name, like I said, of the University of Illinois, had been founded in 1867 in Urbana. The establishment law had designated a board of trustees that would include one member from each congressional district and 5 other members from each of the 3 judicial districts of the state, all to be appointed by the governor. By 1873, the board was composed of 34 appointed trustees, overwhelmingly businessmen, lawyers, educators, wealthy farmers, and newspaper editors. In late 1872, one board member from the Southern District resigned early, leaving the need to appoint a trustee from that district to serve out his remaining 2 years. The governor, John Lurie Beveridge, who you see here, a Republican, appointed John Byrd to that position in March 1873. He chose Byrd almost certainly because Byrd had the backing of the white Republican leadership in southern Illinois, and because of Byrd's tireless work toward establishing educational opportunities for blacks in Cairo, his excellent and sophisticated grasp of history, and strong organizational and rhetorical skills, and his growing stature in the Republican Party. Byrd thus became the first African American to receive a major honorific state appointment in Illinois history, as well as the first black member of the Board of Trustees of an essentially white institution of higher education in the state and probably in the entire post-war North. The governor's decision to appoint Byrd was remarkable and provocative. Not only was he an African American, but he also was only 29 years old, whereas most of the other trustees were in their 40s or older. And he was still a Pullman porter, a unique occupation for University of Illinois' Board of Trustees. The appointment almost certainly angered a number of distinguished white leaders in Southern Illinois who would have sought that position. Byrd attended his first meeting in March of 1873, and it could well have become his last. In May of 1873, the Illinois legislature passed a bill reorganizing the governing structure of the university. In it, the Board of Trustees was reduced in size to only 9 appointed members, 3 from each of the state judicial districts. All 34 board members were released, and the governor was to choose 9 afresh. Certainly there was intense lobbying for those seats, but when Beveridge sent the list of new board members to the legislature, Byrd was one of the 3 trustees from the Southern District. This indicates both Byrd's stature within the Republican Party of Southern Illinois, and it also indicates the strength of Beveridge's conviction that a qualified black man should be on the board of the university. This second appointment created a much bigger stir than the first one. When the list of 9 was submitted to the legislature, it naturally made no reference to anyone's race, and numerous anti-black Democrats voted to confirm the roster without being aware that Byrd was African American. Afterwards, on discovering what they had done, there was considerable outrage among the Democrats, both that a black man had been appointed to the board at all and that they had unwittingly voted for him. Although there is little information about his time as trustee besides the minutes from the meetings he attended, we know that the trustee's job was also to make the university and its programs known through their regions. And as agriculture was the main business in Southern Illinois, there's no doubt that Byrd spent a great deal of time discussing agricultural methodologies that were being used and developed at the university with the farmers, many of whom in the region were black. He also would have encouraged prospective students to enroll at the university. It appears that his first term was successful, so that at the expiration of his appointment in 1879, Governor Shelby Cullom reappointed him to the board. We know that Byrd visited Champaign-Urbana for other purposes beyond university business, and that he became well known in the community. This is illustrated by a reference to him in the September 13th, 1876 issue of the Champaign County Gazette that you see here, which noted on the front page of that issue that Byrd was giving a speech that evening at Barrett Hall. Barrett Hall was the leading auditorium in town, which had hosted Susan B. Anthony, Mark Twain, Frederick Douglass, and other major notables in recent years. The notice of his speech was the first item in column 1, way over here, of the front page, and the item only says, "Byrd in Barrett Hall tonight." A follow-up appeared actually down at the bottom of column 2 with the additional notice stating, "Go to Barrett Hall tonight and hear J.J. Byrd of Cairo." Okay? But Byrd in Barrett Hall tonight indicates that the newspaper knew that everybody in town, at least all the Republicans in town, would know exactly who this was. So he was quite familiar to the readers of the Gazette. The next week's edition reported that the lecture was well attended in spite of a severe thunderstorm that evening. In April 1873, so just a month after his initial appointment to the board of the university, he also became the first elected black judge in Illinois history. And again, perhaps in the entire North, where the population of African Americans was exceedingly small still. When he ran for the office of police magistrate in Cairo and defeated 3 white opponents who split the Democratic vote, his election created a firestorm reflected in some furious articles in newspapers across the state, and for several days, a boycott of his courtroom by the Cairo Police Department until the mayor demanded that they cease. His election, along with his appointment to the university, made him a heroic figure in black communities across the state. And during his first term as police magistrate, he gained a solid reputation for integrity, fairness, and honesty. A measure of his reputation can be seen in the fact that when he ran for re-election 4 years later, in 1877, against a single white Democratic opponent, he still won, having received substantial votes from both the black and white communities. 2 years later, in 1879, he became the first African American appointed to a federal position in Alexander County when he received a job with the U.S. Post Office, notably over the objection of Cairo's racist postmaster. In 1874, he broke yet another barrier when he was invited to speak at the opening ceremonies of the Southern Illinois Normal University in Carbondale, Southern Illinois University of today. This was the first time an African American had taken part in and addressed such a celebration. Evidence suggests that this controversial invitation was also engineered by Governor Beveridge and supported by the new president of the university, Dr. Robert Allen, who you see here. The convocation was held on the afternoon of July 1st, 1874, in the main lecture hall of the first, and at that time only building of the university. The program featured a prominent roster of speakers, including Governor Beveridge and Dr. Allen, as well as the presidents of Northwestern University, the Bloomington Normal School, later Illinois State University, and the superintendent of the St. Louis Public Schools. The audience of other dignitaries and leaders, as well as citizens from across the region, was almost certainly all white, and for some, Byrd's presence there was disturbing and outrageous. Apparently, members of the local organizing committee were among those offended people, because they failed to make any arrangements for his visit, unlike everyone else. No welcoming committee, no hotel reservation, no planned dinner for the evening before. He arrived at the train station, found no one there to greet him, and because none of the hotels would admit an African American unless from some official reason, he had to walk a couple of miles out of town to a friend's house for the night. Perhaps these malcontents hoped that Byrd might be sufficiently offended by this treatment that he would leave Carbondale without speaking. But Byrd would not forego this chance to address what was essentially a captive audience of white elites who needed to hear what he had to say. From this speech, and we do have most of his speech from a newspaper account in the Cairo Bulletin, from this speech there developed a long-term friendship between John Byrd and Robert Allen that surfaces in a letter of support that Allen wrote to Governor Joseph Pfeiffer in 1889, 15 years later, in which he refers to Byrd as my friend. An important characteristic that stands out when one looks at the surviving information about Byrd is his incessant public activity. In local affairs, he led the multi-year agitation to establish the African American Public Schools school in Cairo, then pushed for full African American control over that school. He established and became the first worshipful master of Cairo's local Prince Hall Masonic Lodge in 1867. In 1877, he was elected the Grand Master of the Grand Masonic Lodge of Illinois, the highest Masonic office in the state. His excellent oratorical abilities kept him in constant demand for speaking engagements across the state. He worked continuously for the Republican Party, organizing clubs, taking part in conventions, speaking at meetings across Illinois, and sometimes in Indiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. He also spoke at innumerable church functions, civic groups, and community celebrations on a wide range of subjects. He officiated at weddings, at least one of which was for an interracial couple. In doing all of this, he spent a great deal of time away from home, and that took a toll on his family. In 1889, his wife Annie left him and moved to Detroit to live with their now adult sons, who also appear to have been estranged from him. Byrd's loyalty to the Republican Party was enduring. He believed that the only hope African Americans had for influencing government policy with their tiny numbers in the North was to link themselves with the Republicans and to make alliances with white party members who supported the African American agenda. In spite of the fact that many white Republicans abandoned the cause of civil rights in the 1870s and 80s, Byrd never considered changing his allegiance to the Democrats or to an independent party. However, his support for the party did not mean that he simply went along with all of its policies. Throughout his career, he agitated for a greater African American voice in determining the direction of the party. While always staying loyal, he was willing to oppose Republican plans that he saw as detrimental to his people's future. Sources show that he successfully stood up against the local party leadership as early as 1870. In 1879, at the height of his political influence, Byrd led a movement within the black community to pressure the federal government to rescind its reappointment of George McKeague, an intensely racist postmaster in Cairo, and even took his case to Washington, D.C., where he refused a good federal job offer from Illinois Senator John A. Logan if he would drop his opposition to the postmaster, and went on twice to meet with President Rutherford B. Hayes about the situation. In 1880, he also led a state convention of African Americans that criticized Illinois Republicans for failing to incorporate blacks into the power structure of the party. By the late 1870s, his influence and popularity in the state had put pressure upon Southern Illinois party leadership to nominate him for a state office. But in 1880, Byrd made a decision that would short-circuit what seemed to be his inevitable rise. He decided to support a Democrat against the Republican candidate in the race for Illinois Secretary of State, a serious infraction. The reason for this latter fateful choice was that he had known the Democratic candidate for Secretary of State for years, and the two had developed an unlikely friendship. John H. Oberle was the Democratic editor of the Cairo Bulletin between 1868 and 1879. Oberle had arrived in Cairo from Memphis, Tennessee in 1865 as a solidly anti-black Democrat, but he underwent a substantial change over the early 1870s, probably due in large part to Byrd's influence. Byrd had become friends with Oberle and had watched him evolve into taking serious stands in support of basic African American rights during the 1870s, even to the detriment of his own political aspirations in the Democratic Party. In 1880, Byrd decided to publicly support Oberle for the position instead of the Republican candidate, arguing before black audiences that he knew that Oberle would support the African American cause more faithfully than his opponent. He made this choice in spite of the fact that he almost certainly knew that Oberle and the other Democrats on the state ticket had little chance of winning the election. The Republicans were very strong in much of Illinois, including Chicago, and that it would significantly harm his own position within the Republican Party. Nevertheless, he did it. Indeed, it did end any possibility that the white Republican leadership would ever nominate him as a candidate for a significant office. But Byrd's achievements extended far beyond his association with the Republican Party. He had a substantial impact on the Black Convention movement in the state of Illinois, and was a voice in the discussion of national issues as well. As early as 1871, he began attending both national and state African American conventions as a delegate, and by 1876 was often a leading figure in their organization. His colleagues came to recognize the value of his knowledge and his ability to articulate the themes that the delegates believed were important to present to the people of the state and the nation. And thus they regularly appointed him to, and often made him chair, of the Address and Resolutions Committee, where the official convention statements were forged. Through these conventions, Byrd was able to influence the way the black community in Illinois, and sometimes further afield, understood and acted upon the most significant issues they faced. The Byrds lived in Cairo from 1869 to 1887, but as the prospects for the future development of the city declined in the 1880s, he and Annie decided to move to Illinois' capital, Springfield, presumably so that he could be closer to the center of the state government. Although he continued to play an active role in the Republican Party, Springfield's small black community proved to be less influential in the politics of the city than he probably expected. Instead, he found a different outlet in Springfield for his passion to advocate for his community. Shortly after arriving in the city in 1887, he joined Shedrick B. Turner's fledgling newspaper, The State Capital, as Turner's co-editor, and eventually became its editor, helping to build it into one of the leading African American newspapers in the Midwest of the late 1880s and 90s. In 1891, I. Garland Penn, in his groundbreaking book, The Afro-American Press and Its Editors, described the state capitol as, quote, the leading organ of the race west of the Ohio River. It is the recognized organ of the Afro-Americans of Illinois and wields a potent influence in politics. Unfortunately, time constraints don't allow me to discuss Byrd's further career in Springfield. By the mid-1890s, however, the National Republican Party had fully abandoned its black constituents and had become complicit in the rise of Jim Crow policies. While his role in state and national politics was over at this point, Byrd continued to play an honored but declining part in the black community in the early years of the 20th century. By the time he died in 1912, working as custodian of the cloakroom of the State House of Representatives, Byrd's achievements had largely been forgotten by most members of the state Republican Party. However, surprisingly, within a few days of his death, having been reminded of what he had done over the previous half century, the Illinois General Assembly voted to erect a funerary monument that still stands over his grave in Springfield's Oak Ridge Cemetery, and you can see it here. The African American community in Illinois remembered him for decades after his death as Judge J.J. Byrd, who had been a political Moses for his people. But as the world wars came and went and a new civil rights movement emerged, Byrd and most of the veterans of the first such large-scale movement in the late 19th century largely fell into obscurity. That obscurity is slowly being corrected. But the fact is, one's name does not have to be remembered for a person to have an influence on later generations into the 21st century. For over 30 years, John Byrd was a substantial voice in Illinois' black community, and he affected many men and women across the state and beyond who admired and emulated him, and who saw from his character that they too should work toward a better future. Those women and men, in turn, spent their lives working toward justice for which he had called, and in turn, they inspired the next generation, and so on, all of them working toward the goal of greater justice, the one that he had sought. Thank you.